This is CBS.
But look at the blue-collar vote, another Carter must. Blue-collar voters seem to be splitting evenly between Mr. Carter and Governor Reagan, a sign that the Republican candidate is making inroads into that traditionally Democratic vote, and a sign of trouble for President Carter. We also have evidence from our voter poll that the Iran situation is hurting President Carter in this election. A rather large number of Reagan voters saying that they cast their votes because of Mr. Carter's handling of the hostage situation. And finally, we're finding out that John Anderson seems to be taking away some of the Jewish vote from Mr. Carter, but overall, nationally, he seems to be hurting both candidates just about equally. Frank?
Thank you, Lynn. Well, already the votes are being counted. Here is our national vote board reflecting the popular vote. As you can see, the numbers are very low and at this point really quite insignificant. But we will be referring to this board frequently through the night to show you the nationwide popular vote totals. I don't want to suggest that any one of those numbers is insignificant. Every vote counts, but the totals, of course, are not really indicative of anything at this point. However, we do have this bit of information that we can pass along to you. The Carter campaign chairman, Robert Strauss, visited Democratic National Headquarters in Washington tonight. He said he was not certain what was happening, but he said what we hear is very discouraging. Of course, what is really important is the Electoral College vote. 270 required for victory. Our ABC News election night map of the United States is color-coded. It is mainly white right now. It is colored red in Indiana, and that's the way it will be throughout the night. Blue for President Carter, red for Governor Reagan, yellow for John Anderson. So at a glance, we'll be able to see the geographic distribution of the vote. Max?
Well, Frank, even though the results of the voting are just beginning to come in, our computers have come up with some clues to the outcome from several key precincts and voting blocks. We'll take a look at what we call voting keys, what to look for as the results come in. And we'll have the latest on the hostages 1 year after their capture.
All of them should be exhausted. Probably all of them satisfied that they have done all that could be done. We begin with the Carter campaign and White House correspondent Sam Donaldson.
Back home he came to Georgia after an all-night-long coast-to-coast campaign march, to Plains, for a reunion with his wife, who had herself campaigned until the end, to the high school building where he had graduated in 1941 to vote. In the end, his ability to influence the election, no more than that of any other citizen.
I voted for the one I consider to be the best candidate.
Okay. Who is that?
That was myself.
What do you think you would do if you lost this election today?
Well, I obviously would abide by the American people's judgment whether I won or lost.
But I mean your future plans.
Oh, well, I'm counting on winning.
Next stop, the train station, scene of so many happy times from the winning campaign of 1976. This morning, a scene of poignant reunion tinged with foreboding.
Many people from Plains, from Americus, from Richland, from Preston, from Sly County, from around this area, have gone all over the nation to speak for me, to shake hands with people in other states, to tell them that you have confidence in me and that I would not disappoint them if I became president. I've tried to honor your commitment to those other people. In the process, I've tried to honor my commitment to you. God bless you.
This evening, back here in Washington at the White House, the president awaits the returns. But his pollster, Pat Caddell, had already told him going into the election that the numbers did not appear to be there. And so, although there is a victory celebration scheduled at a downtown hotel, most here are prepared to see this day mark not the renewal of Jimmy Carter's presidency, but its ending. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
This is Barry Seraphin. In the Reagan camp, the election day mood was one of confidence. Reagan appeared casual and relaxed as he and his wife Nancy went to vote at a polling place set up at a private home near theirs in Pacific Palisades. However, he continued to be careful when reporters asked how he saw his prospects.
You know me, I'm too superstitious to answer anything like that. Yes.
Inside, the cautiously optimistic Reagan joked with his wife about how to vote, and he dutifully posed for photographers. With reporters and camera crews trailing along, Reagan then went to get a haircut. Afterward, he still was not ready to make any predictions.
How do you feel about the election?
I'm just not going to comment. I'm going to wait and see what happens.
Has your optimism grown beyond cautious yet?
No, President Dewey told me to just play it cool.
You're pretty calm.
Well, yes.
This evening, the Reagans will dine privately with friends, then come to the Century Plaza Hotel to wait for the election results. At some point tonight, Reagan will come to this ballroom where members of the press and his supporters will be gathered. Despite the candidate's earlier public caution, there is little nervousness apparent among his top aides. They seem to have very little doubt that when Ronald Reagan comes here, he will be making a victory statement. Barry Seraphin, ABC News, Los Angeles.
This is Ann Compton. It's over. He knows he won't win. But John Anderson is a happy man. This morning as he went to the polls in his hometown Rockford, Illinois, Anderson was satisfied his independent campaign has given voters an alternative. 8 years ago, Anderson himself refused to vote in the Nixon-McGovern contest. But today he hopes the vote will show the nation is ready to accept a challenge to the traditional parties.
One of the reasons why I am running, and a very important reason, is that I felt it was important to give people that alternative choice so that we would not have millions of people who simply would either leave the top of the ballot blank or not vote.
Congressman, how do you feel about Jimmy Carter?
Through the campaign, Anderson says he has been sustained by the outpouring of support from crowds that match the size and the energy of the major party candidates. His standing in the polls has been cut in half. At the same time, his own spirits have soared.
How much have I enjoyed all of this?
This will be an early evening for Anderson. As soon as he sees how Massachusetts and Connecticut and most of the Northeast are going, he'll know how ready the American people were to break from tradition and what kind of future his independent movement has. Ann Compton, ABC News, Washington.
3 other national candidates received somewhat less attention as they voted today. John Anderson's running mate, Patrick Lucy, cast his ballot in Madison, Wisconsin, then headed for Washington, where he and Anderson will wait out the returns. Vice President Walter Mondale and his wife, Joan, voted early this morning at the Village Hall in Afton, Minnesota. They arrived at 7:30 and waited in line before casting their ballots. Afterwards, they went to have breakfast with their children, declining to talk about today's outcome. However, Vice Presidential candidate George Bush, who voted in Houston, predicted that if the country goes the way of that district, in his words, we're in like a burglar. Afterwards, Bush watched a game of touch football between his staff and press entourage and tossed the ball around a bit himself.
For almost everyone concerned, it is in some way or other a bitter anniversary. Last November 4th, when we reported the news from overseas, no one could have imagined it would go on for so long. When demonstrators scaled the embassy walls a year ago, many insisted they only wanted to hold a demonstration. Well, today it wasn't over the walls, but through the front gate for thousands of Iranians, many of them young, who would gather to celebrate this macabre moment in Iranian-American history. With more, here in London, ABC's Bob Dyke.
There were no votes for Mr. Carter here. In Tehran, he is still the great satanic foe. The rally, the first actually held inside the embassy compound since last year's takeover, was organized by the militants. It may have been their parting shot now that they have promised to surrender the hostages to the Iranian government. For the time being, the government is letting the militants retain custody of the Americans, although Prime Minister Rajai gave a speech saying, "We will take the hostages from the brothers and sisters resident in this nest of spies." Rajai is planning to form a government delegation which will eventually take charge of the hostages. Reports say at least 100,000 people showed up for today's so-called open house at the embassy, though only an estimated 20,000 were let in. There was a military parade. A family atmosphere, said one report. There was no sign of the hostages, but none of the demonstrators was allowed inside the embassy's building. And the militants did not reveal how the hostages spent this day, the first anniversary of the beginning of their ordeal. Meanwhile, the Iranian Foreign Ministry is asking the Carter administration for what it calls a speedy public response to the 4 conditions Parliament agreed to last Sunday for releasing the Americans. The response, said the Foreign Ministry, should be through the media, although diplomatic channels are open between Washington and Tehran. Bob Dyke, ABC News.
This is Barry Dunsmore. The State Department strongly suggested today that it would be some time before the U.S. offered its formal response to Iran's conditions for the release of the hostages.
We will move forward expeditiously, but we will do it deliberately and with care, giving the Iranian proposals the reflection in the study that they merit.
Actually, what's happening is that the U.S. is seeking clarifications of many points in the Iranian parliament's conditions. The official text of those demands was made public here today. It differs very little from the text released on Sunday, which is disappointing and part of the problem. When the Algerian ambassador to Washington delivered the demands yesterday, it was hoped that he would also have either a covering letter or some sense from the Iranian government of how it felt the conditions should be implemented. He didn't, which means many questions remain. Meanwhile, President Carter in Plains today expressed satisfaction with how things were proceeding, but stressed that when the U.S. did respond, it would not be a capitulation.
What we will propose will be to uphold our nation's honor, our integrity. It'll be made public at the proper time, and I think the American people will be pleased.
While the U.S. says it does not plan to negotiate in public, there certainly seems to be a message for Iran in those words, namely that the U.S. wants its hostages, but not at any price. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, the State Department.
In the war between Iran and Iraq, the Iraqi president has offered to withdraw his troops from Iran if Iran recognizes Iraq's rights as won during the 6-week-long war. That's unlikely to happen just now, and on the battlefield, both sides have today made their usual claims. Iraq does appear to have increased pressure on the provincial Iranian capital of Awaz. Iraq claims to have encircled Awaz and captured all the roads in the region. Iraq also says it has annihilated an Iranian brigade that tried to break out of Abadan, but there is no independent confirmation.
ABC News is now able to make another projection. This one, too, involves the state of Indiana. A veteran senator in Washington for 18 years, Birch Bayh, is going to be defeated, according to our returns from key precincts, by Congressman Dan Quayle, the Republican. Quayle, the apparent victor over Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, with 56% to 44%. Well, as you see, the vote totals grow tonight and various states go for one candidate or the other. There will be certain signposts along the way that might point toward the eventual result. Here's a report on that from Santa Van Oker.
There should be certain clues provided in the evening as the returns from today's voting start to come in. In Florida, look for the vote in the Miami-Dade County area. Carter carried the county against Ford by more than 90,000 votes. The Jewish vote here is crucial. If Carter's not winning 2/3 or even 3/4 of that vote, it may signal a fall-off among Jewish voters elsewhere, in states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. In Connecticut, look to suburban Fairfield County for some early indication of the potential size of the Anderson vote and Carter's ability to offset it. Connecticut may also provide some clues as to how Catholic blue-collar workers are voting. The state has the third largest percentage of Catholic voters in the country. And that blue-collar vote is crucial in a battleground state like Ohio, which Carter won in 1976 by only 11,000 votes. Look to key precincts in the Cleveland, Cuyahoga County area for an early indication of how well Carter is doing this time with blue-collar whites and blacks. In Pennsylvania, another battleground, the same will be true when the returns start coming in from Philadelphia. Carter carried the state in 1976 thanks to a 255,000 vote plurality in Philadelphia. He needs to come close to that this time. As these results come in the eastern part of the United States and then into Ohio, and if President Carter does not pile up these pluralities that he needs in the major cities in those areas, then what you may be witnessing is a historical end of a political era. The end of an era began by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 when he welded into an overwhelming coalition, minority groups like Jews, blacks, white ethnic blue-collar workers. And if this does not break for Mr. Carter, then you will see, I think, a historical shift that began with the candidacy of George Wallace in 1964-68 and has been going on all through the 1970s. It is too early to say if it will manifest itself, but if it does, you are going to see something that will mark a change and a radical change in the pattern of American politics. Max?
Thank you, Sander. Americans today are choosing not only their next president, but all of the members of the House and a third of the Senate. I'll be keeping an eye on the 13 governors' races, as well as important local legislative contests. 10 of the 13 governorships up for grabs are now held by Democrats. The Republicans predict they'll pick up at least 2 of these, and as Britt Hume reports, the Republicans have similar hopes for the Congress.
The Republicans expect to gain seats in both the House and Senate tonight, but not enough to get control of either. In the House, where the lineup has been 276 Democratic seats, 159 Republican, a GOP gain of as many as 25 seats, an ambitious estimate, would still leave the Democrats in charge. In the Senate, there are 59 Democrats, 41 Republicans, but more Democrats in re-election trouble than Republicans. Still, everything would have to go the GOP's way to give them a net gain of 10 and control of the Senate. Among the noted Senate Democrats on the endangered list are McGovern of South Dakota, Bayh of Indiana, Hart of Colorado, Church of Idaho, Culver of Iowa, and Nelson of Wisconsin. Veteran Republican Jacob Javits, defeated in his primary and trailing badly as the Liberal Party nominee in New York, probably won't be back in the Senate, although Alphonse D'Amato, the man who beat him, stands a good chance of keeping that seat Republican. In the House, Majority Leader Jim Wright has had a tough race to hold on to his Texas seat against the heavily financed challenge of former Fort Worth City Councilman Jim Bradshaw. Wright is favored. In Indiana, House Majority Whip John Bradamus is in deep trouble with an expected Reagan landslide in that state and a competent Republican opponent in 27-year-old businessman John Hyler. 4 other Democratic House leaders, Interior Committee Chairman Udall of Arizona, Agriculture Chairman Foley of Washington, Ways and Means Chairman Ullman of Oregon, and Senior Ways and Means Member Corman of California are also in tough races. And finally, there is considerable interest tonight in the 5 races involving House Democrats either charged with or convicted of bribery in the FBI's abscam operation. Britt Hume, ABC News, on Capitol Hill.
Hard to believe, but the campaign is finally over, and it's the results we'll be talking about from now on. If we're left with something of a bitter aftertaste because of all the harsh words that have been bandied about, thinking that in the good old days it was better, well, James Wooten is about to disabuse us of that weird notion.
It's really nothing new, all this harangue and harumph in American politics. Fact is, it's been the rule, not the exception, for more than 200 years. Consider this view of George Washington. Treacherous in private friendship, a hypocrite in public life. That was Thomas Paine, on the father of our country. Benjamin Harrison, a cold-blooded, narrow-minded, timid, old psalm-singing Indianapolis politician. That's what Theodore Roosevelt said. And Roosevelt himself was known as Old Four Eyes and Telescope Teddy, but not to his face, of course. And there was Silent Cal Coolidge. Weaned on a pickle, said Teddy Roosevelt's daughter. And FDR simply doesn't measure up to the demands of the office, Walter Lippmann wrote. Light Bulb Lyndon, they called him. Landslide Lyndon, they jeered. A rube, a boor, a boob, a bumpkin. And what about High Tax Harry? To err is Truman, the Republicans all chanted in 1948. And Nixon? That man is not fit to be president. Now, who said that? Henry Kissinger. Even Mr. Lincoln here wasn't immune. To millions, he was the Illinois baboon, the tyrant, the buffoon. Said one of his opponents, he is enormously ugly of face and spirit. So no matter how contentious and contrary these fellows Reagan and Carter have been, they didn't invent the nasty campaign. It's been a part of this country's politics since long before either one of them was born. And somehow, the country and its politics have always survived. James Wooten, ABC News, Washington.
Thank you, Jim. Well, we'll be back just a few minutes from now to begin ABC News' continuous coverage of the 80 vote. Our election night broadcast starts at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, almost now. We know you're ready for this fateful evening, and we hope we are. We also hope that you'll join us. That's our report for now on World News Tonight. For ABC News, good night for now.
From CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. America is turning to a new political direction for at least the next 4 years, to the right, Republican. Ronald Reagan rode an electoral vote landslide to the White House, and Republicans also swept to control of the Senate for the first time in a quarter century. The House remained in Democratic hands. With the count of returns almost complete, 99% of the precincts in now, Reagan has a huge electoral vote, 468 to 50 for Carter. That's all but 2 states counted. Massachusetts and Arkansas are still too close to call. Dan Rather has more on the outcome.
Walter, all of the polls had indicated a close race and a long night. They, including ourselves, were wrong. As region after region reported in, it quickly became clear that the public demand for change was wide and deep, sweeping every section of the country. Carter won only Rhode Island, Maryland, West Virginia, the District of Columbia, Minnesota, and Hawaii. Arkansas and Massachusetts are still in doubt. All of the rest, South, East, West, and Midwest, went to Reagan, most of them not even close. Now, how did this happen, especially to an incumbent president who thought he could depend upon the Democratic Party's traditional coalition?
I meet with average Americans every day, not in the big banks and country clubs, but on the streets, in the schools, Americans who work on farms and in the factories.
Trouble was, the party coalition that had supported Carter in 1976 believed that he had let them down, economically and otherwise. Only blacks continued to support him as last time, 83%. Voters from union and other blue-collar families down from 76. Carter winning them too narrowly Tuesday to keep him in contention. Catholics who supported Carter last time did not this time. He went down in support from Jewish voters, 16% of them going for Anderson. Contrary to what the polls indicated might happen, women did not go heavily for Carter. Instead, they divided almost evenly. Men went strongly for Reagan, 5-4. Exit polling at voting places suggests men liked Reagan more because they tend to want the United States to be more forceful in world affairs. Carter's own political pollster, Pat Caddell, claims that at one point his man was ahead and had momentum. The debate, Caddell says, stopped Reagan's slide and became the whole election's turning point. That plus Iran. While the CBS poll indicates that people who decided on the basis of Iran went to Carter, Caddell claims late headlines about the hostages may have been decisive.
And not saying I'm for sure it's the hostage situation as much as it was a change in focus for people away from a presidential choice at that moment to a question of a generally frustrating situation which led to linkage with other frustrations that people had that altered the vote movements at the end.
But Reagan aides and many others believe the economy, inflation more than unemployment, was the key. Our exit polling supports that, and it also indicates high negative feelings toward the candidates. For instance, half the Anderson voters said they were voting against the others. When asked about leadership, polled voters overall put Reagan first by more than 2-1. The theme of we need a change and stronger leadership worked its way all the way down the ballot. For example, changing control of the U.S. Senate, which went from a Democratic majority, 59-41, to the first Republican majority in more than a quarter of a century. Republicans will control the new Senate 52-47, with nearly all the new GOP members from the conservative wing, and the Goldwater race in Arizona remains undecided. Democrats maintained control of the House, 245-190, but their majority was reduced by 31 votes. Even as we analyze the returns and think about transitions, inauguration stands are going up in front of the Capitol for that day in January when the 40th President of the United States will be sworn in, President Ronald Reagan.
Last night and again today, President Carter promised full cooperation in the transition of power to President-elect Reagan. Jed Duval reports.
The president today named Jack Watson, who handled the Carter transition incoming, to take the job again outgoing. Mr. Carter promised the fullest cooperation during the transition, said, "I'll go a second mile to accommodate the Reagan people." These and other Carter reflections came in a morning after chat with reporters. He wants to work with Governor Reagan, Mr. Carter said, on the control of nuclear weapons, even if, quote, "we have to abandon my approach and adopt his. I'll support it," end quote. The president described the problem of strategic arms limitation as the big unmet decision of his administration. Asked what Reagan can accomplish, the president said, "I'm sure Governor Reagan will do the best he can to restore as much as possible our nation's preeminence in some areas where we've not been able to exert our will to dominate others. But the inexorable historical movements are that we don't have control over some things we formerly did." The sudden voter move away from Mr. Carter he explained as America's concern about our lost dominance. I don't think there's any indication in the polls that there was a personal turning against me, end quote. How much of a factor was Billy Carter? That question was put to the president's brother by Bruce Hall.
I'm sure to come out, I bear some of the blame, but I'd hate like hell to say I've had all the blame for this thing.
You're willing to take some of it, though?
Yeah, I'm willing to take some of it. I think I heard some.
In the talk with reporters, the president seemed to count the hostage crisis as a smaller factor and boost the refugee situation, the influx of Cubans, as something that, quote, hurt us badly. It was a burning issue, he said. It made us look impotent. I don't see how we could have handled it better, the president added, but there was a political cost. Soon the president was stepping through a crowd of several hundred White House and executive branch staffers, making somber goodbyes with cabinet members. He left with Mrs. Carter for some days at Camp David and time, if he chooses, to reflect on what happened, to wonder, like the dazed prizefighter, where that punch came from. Jed Duval, CBS News, the White House.
Good. Several prominent liberal senators lost their seats in this Reagan sweep, and two longtime conservative leaders had close races. Herman Talmadge, the Georgia Democrat, lost his. But apparently Barry Goldwater, the Arizona Republican, has won his. His opponent has conceded, but the hairline edge made others wary of calling the race. More on the Senate from Bruce Morton.
The National Conservative Political Action Committee hit list was 6 senators long. Alan Cranston of California survived. Thomas Eagleton of Missouri survived. But Frank Church of Idaho lost his seat. So did George McGovern of South Dakota, and John Culver of Iowa, and Birch Bayh of Indiana, all out. Today, NCPAC's Terry Dolan was claiming scalps and warning that even President-elect Reagan had better mind his conservative P's and Q's.
What that means to me is that Ronald Reagan has not only a moral obligation to do the things he did, he has a political obligation to do it. And if he doesn't do it, my suspicion is that he will pay the political price for not being a conservative president.
But liberal John Durkin of New Hampshire lost too. So did Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, and they weren't on the hit list. Were the conservative hit groups really effective? Or were the liberals simply victims of the general Reagan landslide, done in by Reagan's coattails? Birch Bayh ran way ahead of Jimmy Carter. He thinks the Reagan landslide, not NCPAC, did him in.
You look at the size of that Reagan margin, and you look at about 250,000 people in Indiana voted for Birch Bayh, who also voted for Ronald Reagan. That's a lot of folks that weren't intimidated by a bunch of right-wing haters.
McGovern and Church also ran much better than Carter and could claim to be victims of the general Reagan sweep. But in Iowa, conservative Charles Grassley ran a little ahead of Reagan. NCPAC? Maybe. NCPAC spent about $1 million in its target states. Iowa observers say it was a factor there, but not the factor. That was the Reagan tide. Right-wing groups were influences, elements in a winning coalition. There have always been groups which favored liberals, too. The conservative group's influence yesterday means there will probably be more such groups next time, backing candidates they favor, attacking candidates they oppose. Defeated liberal George McGovern said last night he'll form one to counter the new right.
I have concluded that the nation needs a powerful antidote to the poison of extremism.
Ideological and single-issue groups are a growth industry these days. Political parties are not. Bruce Morton, CBS News, New York.
Phil Jones has a report on what the change to Republican control will mean in the Senate.
In the Senate Minority Office today, all Republicans could see was power. Spotting a painter at work outside his office, Senator Baker quipped, "Look at that. I've been trying to get that window painted for years." Baker was also jubilant because he claimed he had more than enough colleague votes to become the next majority leader, despite ultra-conservative wishes to dump him. And there was a sense of coming power for others.
Hello, Mark. I want to see the new chairman of the Appropriations Committee. I really do.
That's great.
Oh, you are great. I never thought we'd live to see the day.
And few Republicans thought they would live to see Finance Committee Chairman Russell Long replaced by Bob Dole, Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Frank Church, a Democrat, replaced by Charles Percy, John Stennis, Armed Services Committee Chairman, replaced by John Tower, Agriculture Committee Chairman Herman Talmadge out, Jesse Helms in, and liberal Edward Kennedy, Judiciary Committee Chairman, replaced by conservative Strom Thurmond. and Thurmond was quickly sounding the theme, dramatic change is coming.
Yes, I'm tougher on crime than he is. I favor the death penalty and he doesn't. And I favor, in the case of drugs, more severe penalties than he does. And just about all forms of law enforcement, I think that my position will be stronger than his.
There were predictions of new life on Capitol Hill for several controversial issues, such as prayer in school, balanced budget, anti-busing, anti-abortion, Republican ideas on tax cuts, and general overhaul of federal programs with liberal philosophies.
The election on yesterday was a watershed election in this nation because it portends changes in the fundamental public policies of this nation.
In the fell clutch of circumstance, we have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, our head is bloody but unbowed. We are not going to roll over and play dead. We'll be cooperative. We'll be responsible.
It will be next January before the Republicans actually take control. And one senior GOP senator worried out loud today, saying, you know, we have a problem. We've been the minority so long, it's going to take time to learn how to lead. Phil Jones, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Although the Democrats retained the House, they lost some of their key leaders, most notably Majority Whip John Bradamus of Indiana and Ways and Means Chairman Al Ullman of Oregon. Influential Thomas Ashley of Ohio also went down. In the 13 governor races, Republicans won 7, Democrats 6, for a net Republican gain of 4. That makes the new lineup of governors 27 Democrats and 23 Republicans.
Morning, everyone. Morning, Charlie.
Maxwell House is starting out your
morning, Charlie.
Maxwell House can brighten up your day. Maxwell House is coffee you can count on. Maxwell House will start you on your way.
Get your mornings rolling with the great taste of Maxwell House. Coffee you can count on, and always good to the last drop.
Oh, have some of my coffee, Charlie.
Good to the last drop.
My
Maxwell House.
There's more time to do what you want to do. More time to be what you want to be. When you set yourself free.
Set yourself free with Stouffer's. Do what you want to do, Stouffer's. Be what you want to be.
Set yourself free.
Set yourself free. Stouffer's.
President-elect Reagan was still relishing his victory as he set in motion the preparation for taking over the White House. Jerry Bowen reports.
The winning Republican ticket posed for photographers at the president-elect's Pacific Palisades home today, while the movers began hauling furniture to the Reagan Transition Office in Washington, where decisions will be made on the more than 3,000 top-level political appointments to be made by the new administration. The list has already been narrowed on cabinet posts. Under consideration for Secretary of Defense, Senator Henry Jackson, a Democrat, described by one Reagan advisor as an acceptable hawk. Also mentioned for defense, former Treasury Secretary William Simon. The leading candidate for Secretary of State is said to be George Shultz, another former Treasury Secretary and now Vice Chairman of the Bechtel Group. Also mentioned is Caspar Weinberger, former HEW Secretary and Reagan's Welfare Secretary in his California administration. Alan Greenspan, economic advisor to Reagan during the campaign and a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Ford administration, is a candidate for Treasury Secretary, as is Simon and Shultz. The cabinet appointments are expected to be completed and announced by early December, so the appointees can participate in what Reagan's advisors say will be a major reorganization of the management of the executive branch.
I think that you have to restructure the relationships between the president, the White House staff, and the cabinet in a way where they do in fact operate as a team rather than merely picking up the traditional way of doing things.
The Reagan way of doing things, say sources, will mean that all cabinet members will have offices in the White House, be expected to spend part of each day there, and participate in 2 to 3 cabinet meetings each week. The Reagan way will be team management.
I think that the cabinet will be a group of key management communicators, management and policy formulators who will be working as extensions of the president to the various departments and agencies of government.
But the real keys to the Reagan approach will likely be Meese and Michael Deaver, both longtime advisors and trusted aides, the Reagan Palace Guards. Reagan's advisors say the major difference in the new administration will be a president who makes policy decisions without getting bogged down by what they call detail. In short, a chairman of the board who happens to have the presidential seal on his desk. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
President-elect Reagan will hold a news conference tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and CBS News will carry it live. As the Reagan staff winds up its presidency, the Carter staff winds down. Vice President Mondale saw in the returns a trend he believes alarming. More on that from Lem Tucker.
In 20 years in politics, losing was a new experience for Walter Mondale. But what seemed to worry him most today was the loss of so many liberal politicians. Beaten, he said, by massive amounts of interest group money.
They give big bucks with something in mind. And I think this undermines trust. This government should belong to the people. It should not be for sale. And there should not be a smell that it's been sold or doubts about that. And I predict not too long from now that the issue of this big money casting a dark cloud over the integrity of the American political system will become a great issue, and the American people will demand a stop to it.
When Mondale returned to Washington this afternoon, his aides no longer fought back the emotion of the loss. They, like the vice president, are pondering the future. He could run for the Senate from Minnesota in 2 years, but it is 1984 that the Mondale camp now thinks about when they figure they'll have to fight Edward Kennedy for the nomination. Lem Tucker, CBS News, Washington.
All but unnoticed in the thunder of the Reagan landslide was the fate of referenda on state ballots around the nation. Missouri said no, but Oregon approved measures limiting nuclear plant construction. Less sweeping nuclear legislation was okayed in the state of Washington, but defeated in Montana and South Dakota. 2 of 8 states approved property tax reduction bills. Californians rejected a measure that would have banned smoking in many public places. And in Iowa, voters turned down a state equal rights amendment. Foes said it would threaten 6-girl basketball. We will have more on the election later in this broadcast and in a special report tonight at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time. Despite the Reagan victory, it was business as usual on the American hostage issue at the State Department today. Spokesman John Tratner, repeating the administration's position, said the United States is definitely amenable to face-to-face negotiations with Iran. More on the story from Diane Sawyer.
State Department officials say Ronald Reagan will not be asked to advise or concur with U.S. positions in the hostage negotiations. However, they add
every presidency has
economy and for business.
The country made a 180-degree turn, and what you're seeing is a move away from big government spending toward a more relaxed economic attitude. In other words, a hands-off policy by the government.
There was heavy trading in the oil stocks and the blue chips. So many investors wanted to buy stocks like General Motors and IBM, the exchange was late in opening trading in them. That was also true of the defense stocks, such as Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, because Ronald Reagan has talked about increasing defense spending.
Nobody can say how much higher stock prices will go, but some Wall Streeters feel the Federal Reserve Board will soon push interest rates even higher, and that could slow up this Reagan rally. Today, though, they were too busy trading here to do much talking about that. Ray Brady, CBS News, New York.
And that's the way it is. Wednesday, November 5th, 1980, the 368th day of captivity for the American hostages in Iran. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News election headquarters in New York. Good night.